Yep.
Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of our Brunch and Learn webinar series. We're thrilled to have you tuning in with us today and hope that you are all staying well. I'm Muriel Vincent, the new Communications and Social Media Coordinator at the Climate Reality Project Canada. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dean Evangeliou, National Campaign Manager, and our speakers of the hour and climate reality leaders, Dr. Joyce Lee and Dr. Jeremy Theal, two physicians concerned by the effects of climate change on our health and who currently work in Toronto, as well as Audrey Despaux of the Quebec Electric Vehicle Association. This Brunch and Learn series is an opportunity for us to explore the topics covered in the National Climate League standings. The 2019 standings feature 15 primary sustainability indicators benchmarking climate action among participating cities across Canada. It also features examples of best practices in those areas. We invite you to download the standings from ncl.climatehub.ca and to explore our webinar series at hubflix.climatehub.ca. For today's feature, we are looking forward to discussing the many benefits, including on our health, of adopting electric vehicles as a sustainable alternative to fossil fuel dependent vehicles and how they can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Additionally, we'll be presenting you with an overview of how municipalities across Canada prepare for the deployment of electric vehicles from their public policies to infrastructures. Today, as I mentioned before, we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Joyce Lee and Dr. Jeremy Theal. Dr. Lee and Dr. Theal are a husband and wife team concerned about the effects of climate change and what kind of world their 6-year-old daughter will inherit. They trained as climate reality leaders in Mexico City in 2018. Since then, they have given over 40 presentations to community groups, businesses, and healthcare providers on the health impacts of climate change with the goal of inspiring individuals to act. They have been driving electric vehicles since 2013. I'll quickly remind everyone that you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will visit some of these during the Q&A period following our speakers' presentations. And I want also to mention that a recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel and on our Hubflix in the days following the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, and Joyce, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Okay. There we go. Can you hear us now?
Okay. Thank you for having us. We're going to talk about the health benefits of electric vehicles. Climate change is not only an ecological emergency, but it's actually a medical emergency, according to the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate Change. So how does climate change affect health? It turns out that it is through a very complicated interconnected web. As you can see, through extreme weather events, which are direct effects of climate change, as well as food security, air pollution, allergens, water cycle, infectious disease, and mental health. Today, we're going to focus on air pollution. Every year, air pollution from fossil fuel combustion already kills 8.7 million people globally. This is higher than the number killed by smoking, which is 7.2 million people per year. Much of these effects occur through the inhalation of particulate matter, PM 2.5. It turns out that PM 2.5 inhalation affects our blood vessels in the way that it causes inflammation in the blood vessels, leading to heart disease and stroke. The European Heart Journal reported a couple of years ago that up to 80% of air pollution-related deaths in Europe are actually secondary to heart disease and strokes. And along with this, there are also other effects, of course, including respiratory conditions, lung cancer, and even neurodegeneration. The annual premature deaths from inhalation of PM 2.5 in Canada is 14,000 per year. And it turns out that this is way more than the number that are killed by car accidents. So when we tell people as physicians to always wear their seatbelts, what are we doing about air pollution? This study is very interesting. It came out in June 2020. It's called Clearing the Air. It was done by the Ontario Public Health Association. In the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, air pollution causes more than 3,000 premature deaths every year. And one of the biggest sources of this air pollution is vehicle traffic. This is linked to, as we mentioned, cardiovascular conditions, but also lung cancer and respiratory conditions. It turns out that replacing a single gas-powered vehicle or ICE vehicle with an electric vehicle can bring almost $10,000 in social benefits. And this includes the healthcare dollar reduction, as well as the reduction of absenteeism. Switching to electric vehicles and public buses can achieve half of the reductions that are needed to meet Ontario's 2030 carbon emission reduction targets. Now let's take a look at this graph. If we convert all the cars and SUVs to 100% electric in this area, in Toronto and Hamilton area, we can prevent 313 deaths per year. And we can have $2.4 billion in the cost savings in our society per year. If we just replace the trucks with cleaner trucks, we're going to prevent 275 deaths per year, and the cost impact is $2.1 billion saved. If we convert our public transit buses to 100% electric, we're going to save 143 lives per year and save $1.1 billion in social benefits. It turns out that in this time of pandemic, there's also additional benefits from reducing air pollution. The Harvard School of Public Health did a study looking at data from 3,000 US counties over 17 years, and they found that if a person is exposed long-term to a 1 microgram increase in PM 2.5 per cubic meter of air pollution, they have an 8% increase in the risk of coronavirus death. This is because of the chronic inflammation that is caused by the exposure to PM 2.5.
So talking a little bit more about electric vehicles, when you're lobbying Canadian municipalities, oftentimes Canadians feel, hey, we don't pollute that much. Come on, why do we need to worry about converting to electric vehicles? Well, it turns out, and I think this is a mind-blowing chart. This comes from Diane Sachs, the former Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, that Canada actually has the most polluting vehicle fleet in the world, like worse than Poland and Latvia and all these other places that you think would have horrible vehicle pollution. So this is based on the average liters of gasoline equivalent consumed per 100 kilometers. And here's the reason why. Here are the top 5 best-selling vehicles in Q1 2020 here in Canada. And maybe you can guess what some of these are. Pickup truck, pickup truck, pickup truck, pickup truck, SUV. We don't need to say anything further. So Canadians love their big vehicles and they love burning gasoline, and this is a problem. Now, you may have heard some people try to refute the conversion to electric vehicles, saying, "Oh, but the battery takes so much energy to produce that actually, over the lifetime of the car, that the electric vehicle will actually produce more emissions than a gas car because of the carbon emissions from producing the car and its battery." And this chart is to really refute that data. So this is based on driving and charging an electric vehicle for 10 years in Ontario. And you can see here that the blue part of manufacturing a vehicle is the same across whether it's a gas-powered car or it's an electric car. The difference comes, of course, in producing the battery. And you can see here if you have some different sizes of battery, here's a 30 kilowatt hour, here's 75, here's 100. These green bars show how much additional carbon emissions are produced as you create that car and its battery. So it is true that the electric vehicle starts off at a disadvantage compared to the combustion engine car that doesn't have any carbon emissions from producing a battery. However, over the lifespan of driving this car, 10 years, which is the equivalent of about 160,000 kilometers based on Canadian averages, if you were to charge that car in Ontario, where the grid actually has very little carbon emissions for producing electricity, the lifetime emissions for driving that car are about 60 to 68% lower compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle, even when taking into account producing the battery. And the other thing that's interesting about electric vehicles is that they're the only vehicle that gets greener over time. So this you buy today could actually produce fewer carbon emissions 3 years from now than it does at this moment. And this series of charts from the Union of Concerned Scientists in the US shows exactly why that's true. What we're seeing here is different electrical grids in the US, and it shows the equivalent miles per gallon you would be getting if you charged an electric car and drove it within that jurisdiction. So you can see here, for example, that some are quite low, 35 miles per gallon. That's actually worse than some ICE vehicles, but in some cases, not too bad, 115 miles per gallon in upstate New York. Now, that's 2009, though. You can see that as the grid progresses over time, we see that there's a big change in the efficiency of these grids, and it's because more and more coal plants are being retired, and we have more renewable energy feeding power into these grids. So now driving an electric vehicle as of 2018 in upstate New York, you get the equivalent of 259 miles per gallon. There's certainly no internal combustion engine car that comes anywhere close to that. Even a hybrid is probably not much better than about 50 miles per gallon. So 85 to 225% more efficiency from the same electric vehicle in just 9 years. And here in Canada, we can see, and I'm using this example of Ontario, 96% of the electricity usage based on 2017 data is fossil fuel free. So charging a car in Ontario, you can see that actually there are very few carbon emissions. Compare that to one of the worst examples in the US, where over 80% of the electricity that is produced generates carbon emissions. Just a couple of other points as we talk to our stakeholders about electric vehicles. There's a benefit to the individual in terms of costs as well, even if you don't care about carbon emissions. So here's some statistics around the cost of fuel. Basically, if you were to drive a BMW 3 Series versus a Tesla Model 3, similar size car and capabilities, the savings in just gas alone is $6,800 over 5 years, even taking into account the cost of electricity. And in terms of the cost of maintenance, well, an electric drivetrain only has about 17 moving parts. If you look at, for example, a Tesla Model 3, compared to 200 plus moving parts in a gas car. So long-term data have already shown that there's about a 57% saving in the maintenance part of owning an electric vehicle versus gas. So the total cost of ownership, and this is looking at a study from New York City where they have a municipal fleet of over 1,800 vehicles spanning everything from an ICE car to a hybrid to a plug-in hybrid to an electric vehicle. The total cost of ownership, even though the electric car costs more money out of the gate to buy, and you have to buy an electric charger for home, the end savings over the life of 9 years is 21% cheaper to drive the electric. And if you're taking advantage of the Canadian $5,000 rebate, it's about a 30% cheaper ownership experience versus the ICE car. So these are some of the data you can share as you lobby and talk to your stakeholders. Thank you for your attention today, and we'll take questions at the end of Audrey's presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce and Jeremy, for this wonderful presentation. We will now hear from Audrey Despaux, Vice President of the Board of the Quebec Electric Vehicle Association, formerly National Manager here at the Climate Reality Project Canada, and trained Climate Reality Leader since 2010. Audrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marielle. So there's been a very good background presentation provided by Jeremy and Joyce. Now what I'd like to do is dive into some of the policies and some of the things that municipalities can do, the tools that are accessible to them to actually accelerate EV adoption. There's quite a lot that cities can do actually to support EV adoption. And just before, trying to just move slides here. Okay, just before I do that, maybe a little bit of context as to where we currently are at in Canada in terms of EV adoption. As of end of June 2020, there were 168,000 electric vehicles in Canada. So that includes battery electric vehicles, but also other plug-in vehicles like plug-in hybrids. And so in terms of ZEV target sales, the Canadian government has already recognized that reducing transportation-related emissions will be really critical for it to actually meet its target of 30% greenhouse gas reductions below 2005 levels by 2030. And so in order to achieve that goal, the Government of Canada announced targets last year of 10% ZEV sales by 2025, 30% by 2030, and 100% by 2040. So those are sales targets. So keep in mind that all of the vehicles that, all of the gas vehicles or internal combustion engine vehicles that are sold in 2030 will also be on our roads for the next potentially 15 to 20 years after they are put in service. And to put all of these targets into context, where we are currently, at least in March 2020, that's the latest ratio that I was able to get my hands on. But in March 2020, that was the best ever month for ZEV in terms of market share. We had 5.6% of Canada's market share at that point. And what's clear is that this trend is positive. The market share is increasing year over year. It varies month to month, but it is increasing. So that's positive. Now, before we dive into the actual policies, there's a couple of barriers to EV adoption to keep in mind to orient the actions that are important to prioritize, both in terms of education, but also in terms of which policies to put in place to accelerate EV adoption. So the first one is access to EV charging, and I can't stress this one enough. Yes, public charging is very crucial, but also convenience is really key here. 80% or more, and in some cases, that's close to 100% of EV charging sessions takes place at home. So convenience is really key. If you don't have access to a charging station, either at home or where you park for several hours at work, it's definitely not an ideal scenario for a driver. Nobody wants to be stranded. Nobody wants to ask themselves, will I be able to fuel my car at the end of the day or at the end of the week? So access to charging is a very, very high barrier in some cases. Single homes, single family homes, it's fairly simple, fairly easy and low cost, but when we start to dive into the needs of the charging needs of people who live in multi-unit dwellings, it becomes a little more complicated. We'll get back to that. The second barrier is variety, choice of vehicle. So in recent years, or since EVs are on the market, there's been an increasingly wide variety of zero emission vehicles available. But until now, there haven't been any ZEV pickup trucks. There have been very little fully electric SUVs. And as Joyce and Jeremy presented just before, those are some of the most popular vehicles in Canada and all of North America, really. And so for those who are waiting for electric pickup trucks to be on the market and SUVs, electric SUVs to be on the market, there just hasn't been a lot of choice for them. And third barrier, range anxiety. So nowadays, there's actually a variety of EVs that can offer more than 300 kilometers of range. There's a lot of choice, and some EVs even offer more than 600 kilometers of range, which is in many cases more than a gas vehicle. But even though that's a lot more range than what people actually need for their daily driving needs, there's still this mindset that, you know, people are afraid that somehow their vehicle will run out of energy and they'll be stranded on the side of the road. Whether that's justified or not is another question, but either way, this mindset is still there, and it's important to keep educating people and keep talking about all of those vehicles that can meet their driving needs, at least 99% of their driving needs. The final barrier is cost. So that's one of the biggest myths about electric vehicles, is that they're too expensive. But a lot of people, and again, Joyce and Jeremy mentioned this before, but a lot of people don't actually take into account the low cost of ownership. And so we have to rewire our brains to think differently about vehicle ownership and the cost of using a vehicle. So I think that one will largely vanish over the next couple of years. Obviously, the rebates that are provided by some provincial governments and a new rebate provided by the federal government will help with that barrier. Now, in terms of what municipalities can do to alleviate some of those barriers and accelerate EV adoption, a lot of them have to do with the charging barrier. I've specifically chosen those ones because that's, I think, those are some of the highest potential actions that can be taken by municipalities. But the first one, and that's highlighted in the NCL reports, is installing public EV charging stations. So of course, private companies can do this, but municipalities can also have a very large role in installing their own EV charging stations, whether it's for curbside stations or for workplace purposes, so for their own employees, for example. Those are useful for people who, let's say, want to charge while they're working, so curbside, but also at night for those who do not have access to a garage or a private driveway. So we often call them garage orphans or driveway orphans. That's just a way to designate people who just don't have access to their own garage. And so for those people, really the most convenient way to have access to charging is through those curbside charging stations. And so that has a variable cost. It's possible for cities to partner with a charging network operator to partly cover the cost of installing those. Or it's possible for municipalities to also apply for provincial or federal funding to offset some of the costs. The second lever that can be used is the requirements for charging infrastructure in new residential, commercial, and institutional buildings. And so this is a very, very important one. First of all, because it costs nothing for the municipality to do this. It's pure policy, it's requirements in either zoning regulations or building codes, and it's just common sense in 2020 to require infrastructure that will be necessary for people to move around and use their vehicles. So in cases where parking spaces are built as part of a new structure, whether it's residential or commercial, if that parking stall is available, then we assume that a vehicle will be using it at some point in time in the future. And so understanding that the world is moving to EVs, it's important that those parking stalls be equipped with, at the very least, the back end infrastructure, the conduits and the cables, and ideally the electrical capacity to receive a charging station. So this doesn't mean that every building necessarily needs to have a charging station, but at the very least provide for the basic infrastructure behind it so that the dweller of that unit or the user of that parking space can then come and install their charging station. There are many ways to do this, and if this is something you're interested in advocating for in your municipality, I would certainly recommend touching base with your provincial or regional EV association. There are electric vehicle associations in virtually every province in Canada, and they can help you with all the technical details of getting that set up. Another option for municipalities is to offer incentives for residential charging stations. And so this is something that I know has been done in Quebec and is still being done by some municipalities. Generally, it goes from $100 to $500 that's offered to a new EV owner to install a charging station in their home. Again, the previous option is a no-cost option, so requiring that charging infrastructure be installed at least in the new buildings is key so that we can wean ourselves off of more costly options like incentives for charging stations. Another option is to electrify the city fleet. So cities can certainly lead the way, modernize their procurement practices, and take into account the cost of ownership of city vehicles when they go for tenders and look for new vehicles to replace older ones. Another option they can use, and I think this is actually a brilliant initiative that has been put in place in several cities. There's at least 21 cities in Quebec and New Brunswick that have done this. They're using a fleet management system for fleet sharing. So their residents can also book the cars, and that allows the city to recuperate their investment much faster and make sure that their citizens can have access to electric vehicles on evenings and weekends when the city is not necessarily using those vehicles. And so if you're interested in looking into this, I'd point you in the direction of Sauver, S-A-U-V-E-R. That's one of the fleet management systems I know of. I don't know if there are others across Canada, but certainly that's a very inspiring example. So that's been done in several cities. I mentioned 21 of them. By the way, those are almost exclusively very small cities. So this is not something that needs to be done by very large cities that have huge budgets. It can be done by cities such as Beresford, St. Quentin in New Brunswick, Tracadie, Carleton-sur-Mer. We're talking about very small municipalities with generally very small budgets. And so what they're really doing is recuperating their investments on the EVs that they put on their fleets. There's obviously, some perks that can be offered, such as reserve lanes, reserved parking, there's awareness and education initiatives. Those are obvious options. I'm not going to go into detail on those ones, but happy to discuss in the Q&A if you'd like. Now, I just wanted to highlight some of the champions who have done some of the policy solutions or have implemented some of the policy solutions that I've mentioned. And so the requirement for EV charging infrastructure in new buildings is not a new thing. It's been done in several cities across Canada, a lot of them in British Columbia. So in the cities you see on the top here, Vancouver, Westminster, North Vancouver, Richmond, Saanich, they have a requirement for 100% of residential parking spaces to be equipped with a level 2 power outlet or a charging station. So that excludes visitor spaces in some cities, but generally speaking, 100% of the residential parking spaces are equipped, in new buildings are equipped with the infrastructure to receive an EV. And there's also a couple of rising stars. Toronto and Laval now have a requirement for 20 to 25% of residential parking spaces to be equipped with level 2 power outlets. And so it makes it a lot easier in those cases, in those buildings, for people to then install their own charging station. It really levels the playing field with single family home dwellers who can generally do this at low cost. Same for Delta in BC, that requires 20% of multi-dwelling units to be equipped with level 2 stations. Now I should mention that in Quebec, there is a provincial building code requirement for certain homes to be, or new homes to be equipped with that infrastructure, but unfortunately that does not apply to buildings that have more than 4 units or 4 units and more. So it's really important for municipalities to complement the existing policies, even in Quebec, where we have some requirements, but it's just not enough. And the biggest barrier is really for multi-unit dwellings. So it's very important that cities require this infrastructure so that we don't require rebate programs forever to then retrofit buildings that were built in 2020, 2021 and forward. So this list is not extensive. There are certainly many more, but I just wanted to highlight a few examples. I'll end here. We could be speaking about options all day, but I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So thanks everyone, and looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Audrey, for this very rich presentation. We'll now enter the Q&A portion of this webinar. So before we go on, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is 30 minutes long, but may go on a little longer if questions persist. So we have our first question for Joyce and Jeremy. What are the populations who are the most affected by air pollution from internal combustion engines, or ICE for short, vehicle emissions?
Yeah, so the most vulnerable populations are children and elderly. And it turns out that, unfortunately, almost 50% of public schools in Ontario are built close to a major roadway. And also a lot of nursing homes are also built close to these roadways. So those vulnerable populations are definitely very exposed to the effects of the air pollution. And didn't have time to mention this, but air pollution exposure also affects the neurocognitive development of children, as well as increase the risk of dementia. Yeah, we'll see in this year, actually, the Lancet is going to come out with a paper on dementia that lists air pollution as one of the risk factors. Mm-hmm. And also women, pregnant women and Black people have been shown because of the fact that people of lower socioeconomic status tend to live closer to areas with more air pollution. There has been studies showing that shutting down a coal plant, for example, which generates similar PM 2.5, actually resulted in a reduction of preterm births, particularly in these populations like Asian Americans and African Americans.
Thank you. We have another question. A moot point in the electric vehicle debate is batteries, since they are made out of lithium, which is bad for the environment, and their lifespan can greatly impact the affordability of electric vehicles. So how can this be addressed?
Do you want us to start, and I'm sure you can pick up too, Audrey.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. Just because we had some reference back to our slides. So the slide that I showed with the 60 to 68% reduction in total carbon emissions over the lifespan of the car is actually based on the GREET model. So the GREET model takes into account the mining and extraction of any fuel source. So that would include, in the case of an ICE vehicle, the extraction and refinement and transportation of the gasoline, and in the case of a electric vehicle where we're mining lithium and cobalt and these sorts of rare earth metals, that is also taken into account in that 60 to 68% reduction. So cradle to grave, you're still better off with EV. And the other piece that we should mention is that there are a number of large companies now working on recycling methods. And a lot of the battery actually can already be recycled. And the remaining components, particularly nickel, I think is still somewhat problematic for recycling. There's still work being done, but I know that large companies that are focused on building EVs are looking at eventually trying to create a completely closed loop for all materials that are within, or almost all materials that are within the battery.
Yeah, I think on that point, I think we can all agree that vehicles, our automobiles in general, are very resource intensive products. And so the best vehicle is always the one you don't have, the one you don't need. If you don't need a vehicle, don't get a vehicle. There's a lot of other modes of transportation that have lower environmental impact, low to no environmental impact. We're talking about using your shoes to walk. However, I think that the big distinction, and you're going there, Jeremy, with your answer, but a big distinction between zero emission vehicles or battery electric vehicles and ICE vehicles is that, contrary to the ICE or internal combustion engine vehicles, the electric vehicles run on batteries, and those batteries can be recycled. On the other hand, the gas vehicle will generate emissions not only through its tailpipe, but through the mining operations related to the fuel that's needed to keep it going through its whole lifetime. And so one of the other tools I wanted to point out, actually, I think it's a really neat tool, very, very useful, partly because you can customize the data that goes into the results that you're getting, but you can customize it based on where you're getting the electricity, the emissions intensity of your own electricity mix in your own province, or even lower to the regional level. But take a look at carboncounter.com. That's an MIT tool, very neat tool. You can look at the life cycle emissions for a broad range of specific models of vehicles. Again, that tool, I believe the last vehicle models that were included in there were 2017. And as Jeremy mentioned, the only type of vehicle that's improving over time is electric vehicles. So not only is the electricity mix improving and emissions are decreasing from energy production, but also from vehicle production as operations scale up, and battery material sourcing improves, emissions are going down. So, but that'll still give you a pretty good idea as of 2017 on the life cycle emissions of electric vehicles versus hybrids versus gas-powered vehicles. You can see the difference there. But yeah, just on the lithium portion, I think, you know, lithium gets singled out very often because the batteries are called lithium-ion batteries, but there's actually quite, you know, a very small amount of lithium in a battery, and that can obviously be recycled as all of the I'm thinking in French right now, all of the metals contained within the battery.
Thank you. We have another question. Car companies tend to promote big trucks and SUVs more because they make more money selling them. What do you think can be done to push automakers to shift to promoting / selling electric vehicles to customers?
Policy, policy, policy.
ZEV mandates. Yeah, absolutely. I think requiring automakers to make and sell electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles is key. And one of the barriers that I didn't specifically touch on earlier was supply and availability of electric vehicles. Demand is not so much an issue, not as much as it used to be anyway, when people didn't know electric cars. But in many provinces, most provinces across Canada, the biggest issue is actually getting your hands on an EV. It can be very difficult, and you may have to wait a year or more to get your hands on an EV. So very often that's just not an option. You need a vehicle to replace your vehicle that just won't start anymore, or to replace your vehicle lease that's ending in a couple of weeks. So supply is key. ZEV mandates, again, that's not a municipal solution. It has to be at the provincial or federal level, but Quebec and BC have ZEV mandates now, and BC more recently, but those are playing a major role.
Yeah, I think realizing the health effects of air pollution and capitalizing on the data, like such as the Clearing the Air study, that's really important for the politicians to realize, you know, how much money they can save in terms of reducing healthcare costs and absenteeism, and how much this is actually affecting the health of our citizens. Now, you know, we used to, as doctors, you know, we were, of course, I mean, and everybody has been aware of the ill effects of smoking for many years. So, you know, we look upon people who are smoking and we kind of stand away from them. We don't want to inhale it. Now I'm looking at tailpipes of ICE cars, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I don't want to inhale that. I don't want my kid to inhale that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, we need that public awareness, and health, I think, is a really good angle to take, because, you know, people can say they don't care about politics, they don't care about the planet or polar bears or anything like that, but everybody cares about their health, their children's health and futures, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then making this information more available so that it affects voting patterns too, because we need to elect government officials who understand the emergency of this situation and enact the sort of policies that Audrey was talking about. And you can see at a provincial level right now, the provinces that have those sorts of governments have those sorts of policies, and the provinces that don't have the right individuals with the right mindset and the right education in place. So we need to vote differently.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So one thing maybe on employment. So Jake is asking, there is, I assume, a natural opposition to electric vehicles by the fossil fuel business, which currently employs a lot of people. What about this?
I didn't hear all of the question.
It sounded like it was talking about you know, there's a lot of people who have jobs in companies that produce, you know, the traditional ICE vehicles.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen to all those jobs if we convert? And I mean, I think
they will produce electric vehicles.
It's a false concern, really,
Yeah.
because I mean, when we talk about a just transition to renewable energy generation and use, then the jobs that are currently in you know, building vehicles that are consuming fossil fuels can be converted very easily to jobs that manufacture battery electric vehicles or other such ZEVs. And we can see that in other industries as well. I mean, when you look at the west of Canada and the concerns around fossil fuels being a major source of the economy in a province like Alberta, there's already recognition amongst people in Alberta and even amongst the oil and gas workers themselves that these jobs have limited lifespan left, and that we need to be moving where the future is headed. And if we want to be a country that is well off and is competing at the national scale to where the economy is going to shift, then we should be focusing our efforts on training and jobs and transition to these renewable sources now, not when we're forced to by government policy or by the planet itself kicking our butts. So when you look at, what's that organization, Iron and Earth? I think
Iron and Earth, yeah. The oil and gas workers in Alberta have formed, you know, an organization that want to basically transition to green energy and
to retrain people to use the skills they already have, but to use them in renewable energy jobs.
Yeah, just like, you know, oil and gas workers can very easily be retrained to work on geothermal or wind or, you know, any of the other renewable energies. I think, you know, it's kind of, the argument is akin to, okay, well, you know, people used to ride horse carriages and then the car came around and, okay, let's, you know, not.
What's going to happen to all the jobs for the people who are looking after the horses?
Exactly.
Or what's going to, you know, when we got electricity, well, what are all the lamplighters going to do? What job are they going to have? I mean, like, come on, like, get with the program. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you touched on a point there. The skills of the people who work in those industries are highly transferable. I mean, building a vehicle. There's a lot of research and development needed, but in terms of the production aspect of it, you know, the automotive sector has innovated quite a bit with the introduction of EVs, but overall it requires a lot of people. If you look at those who are seriously getting into the EV business, they are hiring massively. Electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, a lot of the skills from not only the automotive sector, but also the oil production sector, oil and gas, are highly transferable. And if you look at all of the infrastructure that will be needed over the next couple of decades, that requires a lot of people. So it's been shown. I'm thinking right now of Propulsion Quebec that recently released a report on the incredibly high needs in terms of workforce development and all of the folks that will be needed to carry this transition. So I'm not too worried about jobs being available. That's actually one of the very positive points of this transition.
Thank you for your answers. Maybe a last one because we haven't touched on it. Martin was asking, you haven't talked about carbon pricing as a mechanism to induce a shift to smaller vehicles as fuel costs rise. So maybe if you want to touch on that.
It's true, we didn't. We had, you know, this is a fairly short webinar, and we wanted to stick to specifically the metrics of the National Climate League. So we were asked to focus on, you know, EV infrastructure and the health effects of air pollution and burning fossil fuels. So you're absolutely right. It's a great question, and it is. I mean, it's been shown by Nobel Prize winning economists, right? Like William Nordhaus has already pointed this out, that that changing consumer behavior through policy is an extremely important tool. We should not leave it out of our toolbox. So it's not, you know, an or situation of doing, okay, EV infrastructure and getting rid of gas-powered vehicles. It's also, yes, having those policy levers to say, you know, if it's going to cost me more to buy, not to buy, but to
run.
operate
Yeah.
a pickup truck, maybe I don't need to drive a pickup truck. And you know, there's unfortunately this, even though the facts are pretty clear about this type of policy and what it can do, and there's proof in many jurisdictions that it works, it's still a highly politicized issue, and a lot of false information is spread about carbon pricing, even here in Canada. So we have to keep fighting that false information.
Yeah, and I think we are also addressing the question of EVs from, you know, the lens of, you know, the municipal level. But in terms of carbon pricing, of course, there's carbon pricing schemes at the federal and provincial levels, but there's also the introduction of the clean fuel standard that could, if done properly, could have an impact and could really help accelerate the shift to EVs. There are several mechanisms that exist to do this, or that are being you know, designed as we speak, and will hopefully get into force in the next year or so. But it can definitely play a role, just not necessarily at the municipal level.
Thank you. Thank you all. And that concludes our Q&A. So thank you, Joyce and Jeremy and Audrey, and thank you everyone for attending. We had people tuning from all across Canada, so we're very happy you were able to make it. Be on the lookout for the new Brunch and Learn webinars. We host them every few weeks. If you enjoyed these presentations, you may be interested in our last two webinars on car sharing, propelling us toward a better future, and leaving fossil fuels behind. You can find all of these in the Hubflix on hubflix.climatehub.ca. I know the link was also made available in our chat. And thank you all again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.